This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All, where my guest this week is urban apiculturist Mark Patterson. Mark founded and runs Apicultural, where he works with businesses and communities to invest in natural capital, improving the environment for pollinators, and delivering pollinator monitoring surveys. He provides honeybee hive management solutions, beekeeping training and education, and also supplies quality urban honey to a select group of establishments. So you'd think Mark would be all for the idea of urban honeybees, right? Listen on.
My background is I studied agriculture at college and then went on and studied nature conservation and ecology. I've been involved in nature conservation in ecology since about 13 years old. I've been volunteering from quite a young age with my local countryside team. Now I then went on and did agriculture and studied agriculture, and then went on and did ecology. And the first sort of 10 years of my sort of career, I worked for lots of different NGOs. I worked for most of the big wildlife nature conservation charities in the UK, OSPB, National Trust, worked for Groundwork, Wildlife Trusts, etc. I've worked for a couple of local authorities as well, and a couple of wildlife conservation consultancies and ecology consultancies. I'm now self-employed. I have my own consultancy called Apicultural. So I work mostly dealing with bees and pollinators. So I work with companies, businesses, schools, communities, etc. A lot of my clients are local sort of grassroots organisations, and I work with them to create environments to benefit bees, sort of urban planting projects, designing and building pollinator gardens, going into schools and doing education work in schools about pollinators and building pollinator gardens in schools. But I also work with corporates. So I do a little bit of staff engagement around bees, honeybees, but I also do some green roof work and engage corporates in planting for bees. So I manage their green roof, but I also organise corporate volunteering activities for corporates and things like that. So I do kind of a whole range of stuff. I also do ecological monitoring as well. So I've got a couple of local authorities where I do ongoing monitoring of pollinators in their parks and green spaces. And this is part of their biological recording to find out what's using the site, how it's using the site, and then they can better tweak their management plans to sort of better conserve those pollinators. So that's kind of what I do. Just before I became self-employed instead of apicultural in 2019, before that I also worked for Bedford as a government bee inspector for 3 years. So I've got a lot of experience working with honeybees, and particularly around bee disease management, so identifying, spotting, and dealing with outbreaks of notifiable bee disease.
Wow, you've got quite the pedigree. I mean, super qualified, obviously, to talk about bees and, as you said, bee health. And you've written quite a bit recently about hives in London. And there are, I think, more and more hives for various reasons that are being set up. And I wondered, have you got any idea how many there are now?
It's a difficult question to answer. A lot of our knowledge about how many bees are in London comes from Bedford, National Bee Unit. So they maintain a database of beekeepers in London. They have a site called BeeBase, and it's a voluntary site where beekeepers can voluntarily register their apiaries. So amateur beekeepers can voluntarily register their apiaries. Commercial beekeepers who are members of the Bee Farmers Association, they are meant to mandatory register their colonies because it's a condition of their membership, professional membership of the Bee Farmers Association. But in practice, they don't all register. But BeeBase is a voluntary database, but it's the best database we've got because there isn't any other register of beekeeping. Beekeeping in this country is not very heavily regulated at all, like it is in some other countries. Anybody can get a beehive with no training. They don't need anybody's permission. If you own the land, you can put a beehive there. The only regulations really are around bee diseases. If you get a bee disease, you're required to notify DEFRA that you suspect you have a notifiable disease. But other than that, there's very little regulation. So the BeeBase database is voluntary register, and not everybody registers. So it's not 100% accurate. There's lots of caveats with the BeeBase data. But the BeeBase data, I think the most recent count was over 5,000 colonies in Greater London, and BeeBase have an idea of the percentage of beekeepers that don't register. So some of the estimates, one of the recent estimates that I saw was, the BeeBase data plus this estimate of how many beekeepers don't register. The recent estimate was about 7,400 hives in Greater London. And if you look at the bee-based data, what you see is that overall in London, the average hive density across the whole of the Greater London area is about 3.5 hives per square kilometre, which is not a lot. That's about the threshold for remaining sustainable. But the problem is that it's not homogenous across the city. You have sort of clusters of beekeepers and clusters of areas with very high density beekeeping, and then you have other areas where there are no hives registered at all. So in reality, it's not 3.5 hives per square kilometre. You got some areas of the city where there's Greater London where there's no hives, and other areas where there are very high numbers of hives. I'm talking 50 hives or more per square kilometre, which is outrageously unsustainable. It's a kind of difficult question to answer because the data is not 100% foolproof. It's we have this database plus, but not everybody registers, so we don't know exactly, but we have a guess. We think there's about 7,400 colonies.
So thinking about, as you say, sustainability, are there enough floral resources for these bees to forage on in an urban environment like London?
So there's been lots of research done on this. So some of the research was started in 2011. So myself and some other interested parties got together and we worked with GIGLE, which is Green Space Information for Greater London. They're the Biological Records Centre for Greater London. They hold all of the green space and biological records, wildlife records and things for the city, and all the environmental data. And they had some really good data sets for green space in London. They had all these parks and green space condition surveys. They know what all the park and street trees are in the street trees are in the city. They know what species they are. They know how old they are, when they were planted, things like this. They've got all these habitat condition surveys, when all the nature reserves have been sampled. They've done mapping of green roofs and all this kind of thing. So they had a lot of really good quality data. And they were able to produce a map in 2012 which shows all the quality foraging habitats in London. And what their map shows is the amount of quality habitat per square kilometre. So generally speaking, in inner London, so zone 1 and some parts of zone 2, so the inner parts of London, you tend to have fewer than 2 hectares of quality foraging habitat for pollinators per square kilometre. So there's 1,000 hectares in a kilometre square, and so about 2%. In the city centre, 2% of that area is good quality habitat for pollinators. But a lot of the beehives are in the city centre. So in the city centre, it's not sustainable because there are lots and lots of hives. You have, hive density is quite high, very high. There's parts of the city centre in like Westminster in the city, in Camden, Islington, and also parts of Lambeth and Southwark where you have 50 hives per square kilometre, but very little green space, so it's not sustainable. Further out in the suburbs, when you go into zones 4, 5 and 6, further out, what you find is that there's generally fewer hives, but there's significantly more green space. You might have 20 hectares or more, 20 or 30 hectares more of quality foraging habitat per square kilometre. So there's more quality habitat further out in outer London than in inner London, but unfortunately most of the hives are in the centre of the city, so it's not sustainable. But further out in the suburbs, it's pretty fine. It's the city centre. It's the centre of the city where there's an issue of sustainability.
Again, there's 2 questions for me that come out of that. And one is that if it is quite unsustainable, why are we adding or trying to add more hives into the city? And the other aspect of that as well is, I guess it isn't just a food resource issue. I'm guessing that when you collect bees together in those kind of high density populations, there's environmental stressors already on them, but just that density of population must cause more problems for the bees.
Yeah. So one of the problems we have is we've had decades and decades of this save the bees rhetoric and these save the bees narratives coming out of the media, coming out of organisations like the BKA, the British Beekeepers Association, telling us that honeybees are dying out, honeybees are declining, save the bees. And part of the problem is the media haven't been very clear on these messages. They've kind of muddied these messages and made them very confusing. And so the reality is honeybees haven't declined. The actual data from various different sources shows that honeybees are increasing and have increased in the UK. They've increased in the UK quite significantly. I mean, just in the last 5 years alone, numbers of hives in the UK, registered hives in the UK, have increased by 45%. So they're definitely not declining in the UK. And if you look at hive numbers from 1950 to present, they're pretty stable. There's been little peaks and troughs here and there, but we have as many hives today as we had in the 1950s, 1960s. So they haven't declined. Globally, there's been an 85% increase in hive numbers globally, managed hive numbers globally since the 1960s. I mean, it's a massive increase in hives. Honeybees aren't declining, but these Save the Bee messages are often accompanied, and these Save the Bees campaigns are often accompanied by images of honeybees, which kind of confuses people because the wild bees are the ones that are actually declining and need conserving, the bumblebees and the soldier bees. But often these Save the Bees campaigns and Save the Bees messages that we see in the media are accompanied by images of honeybees, which kind of tricks people into thinking, oh, the honeybees must be in decline. And, we've had beekeeping organisations also saying honeybees are in decline when they're not. So we've had muddied narratives. And what we've had is 2 or 3 decades of people responding to these unclear, confusing narratives and thinking, let's get a beehive because we're saving the bees. So they have good intentions, they're well-meaning, but these good intentions have negative consequences. We're now in a situation where we have too many bees in parts of the city and in other parts of the country as well, not just London. Other cities around the world have the same issue. Berlin has really high hive densities. They have average hive densities of 16 hives per square kilometre, which is significantly higher than London. You've got cities in Switzerland as well, and also in Brussels, that have very high densities of bees. So it's not just here, it's across Europe and across the Northern Hemisphere generally. People have been responding to these Save the Bees narratives, getting bees because they think they're helping the situation, but actually they're kind of making it more difficult. And then to answer your second, so that's part of the reason why we've got increasing hives. Inner London in particular, one of the causes for increase in hives is businesses wanting to do good and wanting to improve their environmental credentials, thinking that getting bees is helping their green image and helping the environment, and getting bees, when again it's kind of not really helping the situation, it's actually counterproductive. So that there's some of the reasons why we've had an increase in beehive numbers and why it's causing a problem. And to answer your second question, some of the other concerns when we have too many bees, there's lots of concerns. So firstly is beekeeping sustainable? We've seen over the last few decades, we've seen honey yields in London dwindle. They've gone down, continue to decline. We've lost lots of floral resources. Development pressure means lots of green spaces getting built on. We've had a recent spate of trees being felled and things like this as well in parts of London. So we're losing green space, we're losing foraging habitat for pollinators. At the same time, we're seeing increasing numbers of honeybees. So honey yields are declining because we've got increased competition among those honeybee colonies, all competing for limited floral resources. There's also concern about wild pollinators and competition from honeybees on wild pollinators. That's a big issue. It's one of the issues that I'm very passionate about. That's quite a serious issue. We've also got issues of civil order. Increased numbers of honeybees means increased instances of swarms in the city centre. And this is a big problem, it's particularly in central London. Whilst swarms are usually quite docile and passive, they're least aggressive when the hive of honeybees is in its least aggressive when it's in a swarm mode, because when they're swarming, they're basically looking for a new home to set up a new colony. They're temporarily homeless. They have no home to defend, no honey stores to defend, no offspring to defend. They're usually pretty chill and relaxed and very rarely sting you. So that they don't pose a sort of immediate danger in terms of them stinging people. But they do cause distress when people see tens of thousands of bees swarming towards them. It does cause distress, and they can cause disruption to businesses. There's been lots of cases in London where swarms have entered restaurants, they've landed on shop fronts, they flew into train stations and shut down train stations, they've landed on signal lights. So trains have been cancelled because the signal lights were obscured. There was a really great example in 2011 where a swarm landed on the traffic lights at Oxford Circus, and Oxford Circus ground to a halt for about 4 hours because none of the traffic could see the traffic lights changing colour. We've had instances of planes being grounded because bee swarms have landed on planes. We've had quite big construction projects ground to a halt because bees have swarmed onto a construction site. The best example was a few years ago, a swarm of bees landed on the main drilling tool that was excavating the tunnel for the Thames Tidal Way super sewer, and it ground that project down to a halt for a whole day. And that's a £4.2 billion construction project. So swarms can cause significant distress to the public and big inconvenience to businesses if they swarm onto a business premises, and also disrupt public transport networks and infrastructure. The other issue is honeybee well-being as well. You've got lots of more increased competition between different hives of honeybees. They're more stressed. It increases their foraging pressure. They're spending more energy trying to forage and less energy keeping themselves healthy. So they get stressed. They're more susceptible to pests and diseases. With lots of hives in a small area, serious bee diseases, highly pathogenic bee diseases are able to spread quickly between colonies. So we get big outbreaks of quite serious bee diseases in London. So London, the last few years, has been the capital for foul brood infections in the UK. We've had huge numbers of foul brood. One year we had over 100 cases in London, which is it's the highest we've ever seen. And it's coinciding with this big increase in hive numbers. So as hive numbers are increasing, we're seeing more cases of notifiable disease in London. And these are quite serious diseases. They're the bee equivalent of anthrax or foot and mouth. And if you get these notifiable diseases, the government come in and they destroy your colonies. One of the issues we have with managing bee diseases in the city centre is a lot of these hives are on rooftops, and you can't dig a hole and have a fire pit on the rooftop to incinerate a colony. And this is something that a lot of these companies that have bees on their rooftops aren't aware of. They're completely ignorant to these issues. So there's lots and lots of different issues that come about because we have too many hives in one area.
Obviously, people, I think, are doing it with the best of intentions. If they're big companies, my cynical head might say, well, okay, sometimes they're doing it to kind of offset any other environmental impacts, negative ones that they're having. But I think most people love the idea of bees, and they like the idea of having honey and looking after the bees and having them in an urban environment, which kind of increases biodiversity. But I think there is a slightly cynical aspect to it, and that is what we spoke about before the interview, which is the companies who are kind of targeting people and saying, here you go, have some hives, and this is kind of what you do with them, and installing them and everything. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so it is a bit of an issue. For quite a long time, there's been a handful of small London-based businesses that were supplying bees to corporates and or managing hives for corporates. And it's something that I do a little bit of. I don't do a lot of it. The main part of my work is doing more bee surveys and ecology stuff and teaching. But I do have a couple of clients who I manage hives for. Most of my clients that I manage hives for, they were kind of sold bees and had bees installed by a previous company or previous beekeeper quite a long time ago. And then a few years ago, I became the latest beekeeper. I took over their contract and managed their hives. I've only got 2 clients who have ever put bees on their rooftops. And both of those projects didn't result in a net increase in hive numbers in the city centre because I was redeploying some hives from somewhere else nearby that I'd recently taken over management of. But so there's quite a few different people who have been managing hives for corporates in the city for 10, 20 years. And they're quite small local outfits, and they know the local area. They all know the local beekeepers. We all know each other, and we all are fully aware of the situation with there being high hive densities in London. And most of these local outfits that manage hives for the corporates are being quite responsible. They're making sure their corporates have small apiaries. They're often turning inquiries down, saying, no, we're not going to put hives there because it's not sustainable. And they're actually doing what they can to get their clients to promote more flower planting and create more habitat. And quite a few of us in recent years have actually discouraged our clients from having bees and convinced some of our clients to not keep bees anymore. So we've been trying to reduce the number of hives in certain parts of the city to kind of relieve this competition pressure that we're concerned about and try and make it more sustainable. But the issue is in the last few years, there's been a number of big commercial outfits that are typically not based in London. They don't understand the London beekeeping situation. They don't understand the London beekeeping community. They're not fully aware of the situation in London and the lie of the land. They're coming from abroad. I mean, we've recently had a French-Canadian company make inroads into London. We've got companies in Scotland. We've got companies in Wales. We've got quite a few companies that are based quite far away in other parts of the UK that are targeting businesses, and so they're eyeing up the London landscape and basically seeing it's a business opportunity, and they're targeting London businesses, and they're promoting, get beehives, install beehives. It's great for staff engagement. It's great for sustainability. You get your own honey. It's boosting pollination in the city, which to some extent is true. There are lots of benefits to keeping bees and staff engagement. Well, engagement is one of the really good strong points, but they're often promoting biodiversity and promoting sustainability and saying that it's going to benefit the environment. And actually, In London, it's not, because we've already got more than enough honeybees to pollinate all the plants and things like that. And as we've said before, it's actually getting to the point where it's becoming grossly unsustainable in the city centre to have so many colonies. But these companies are promoting it as sustainability, and a lot of it is greenwash, and it's misleading. They're often not informing their clients of all the potential consequences of having bees, about the reputational risks if your bees swarm and cause disruption to your neighbours. They're not warning these potential clients about the potential impacts of getting a note fibre disease and having to have them burnt on site and where can you get a fire pit and things like this. They're not coming up with contingency plans to deal with disease outbreaks and things. So they're being very misleading. But there's quite a few of them, and they typically have big glossy brochures and big glossy websites. They're not usually based locally. Their beekeepers who are doing the work for them aren't always based locally, so they might not be coming frequently, like weekly during the spring, just to check for swarms and things like that. So we're concerned that it's going to lead to more swarms because they're not being looked after. They might not be getting looked after properly if they haven't got someone local on the ground doing the work. Some of them have business models which aren't really sustainable. They're kind of based far away. They employ a local amateur beekeeper with minimal experience and pay the minimum wage to work on the ground. And it's just not really sustainable. What you find is that the people they're employing will do it for a year and then they'll leave because it doesn't pay them well enough. It's not sustainable enough. And then they just recruit someone else. And I've heard of cases of clients being very unhappy with some of these services from some of these big commercial outfits because they're not getting a quality service from them in terms of having someone come regularly who knows what they're doing and is engaging with them properly. So there's lots of issues, but the sort of real concern is that they're coming into the city and they're just pumping more hives into the city, and they're either ignorant of the situation or they just don't care because they're profit motivated. So that's one of the issues we have with some of these big commercial outfits that are coming into London.
If, as I said, I'm sure lots of people do want to, in inverted commas, save the bees. If you were in London, and I'm going to take London as the example because that's where you're kind of doing, I think, most of your work, but it's applicable presumably in many, many urban centres, not just in the UK but across the world. If you did want to help the bees in any way, what would you recommend to somebody who was, for example, in London?
The best thing you can do is create a habitat. So if you've got green space, if you're a business park or an industrial estate or a shopping centre and you've got green spaces, it might be green space around a car park. You might have amenity areas around your buildings. You might have a green roof or a roof terrace that can be planted. Improve the planting for pollinators. Create habitat. Create pollen and nectar rich sources for the bees and other insects to forage on. If it's an amenity area, these can be pretty garden flowers that are good for bees. There's lots of garden variety flowers that are really good for bees. If you have more wilder, extensive areas, you could look at letting the grass grow, or putting some wildflower plug plants in your turf and things like that to create more meadowy areas, wilder areas, rewilding parts of your estate to help provide habitat for pollinators. You can look at including nesting habitat for pollinators. Wild bees need places to nest. They don't live in a beehive like honeybees do. And the majority of them live underground, in burrows underground. So they need sort of dry. Many of them need dry, sandy soil to nest in. Quite often need like exposed, raised soil profiles to nest in. So you could create a nesting bank for them. You can put solitary bee hotels up to encourage cavity nesting bees to nest, things like that. So you can do those things, create habitat for wild pollinators, and then you're helping the bees that need help the most. You're helping the wild bees, the ones that are really declining the most, need help. Because honeybees aren't declining. Getting a hive of honeybees does not protect honeybees or conserve bees. Honeybees are managed livestock. They're basically a farmed animal. They're keeping them primarily to produce a food product, which is honey. So if you look at the dictionary. The dictionary meaning of livestock, honeybee fulfill all the criteria of livestock. They're an animal that are predominantly kept, managed and predominantly kept for food production. And they're not a wild animal. It's illegal to own wild animals in the UK. Honeybees, you own them. You buy the hive. You buy the package of bees to put in them. Since you own them, they are therefore livestock. So honeybees are not nature conservation. They're not wildlife conservation. They're livestock. It's a sort of farming. We call it apiculture. The key word being culture, as in agriculture, permaculture, aquaculture. It's a type of farming. Okay, so getting honeybees definitely is nothing to do. Creating a habitat is. The other thing that you could do if you were really wanted to have local honey, to use in your business, in your restaurant, or to give to staff as rewards, things like that, you could hook up with a local beekeeping association or another charity that has bees, a sustainable beekeeping outfit locally, and sponsor them, get some honey, and get a supply of honey from them. There's lots of other organizations that do work to conserve bees that you could make donations to and support. And in return, they can come and do staff outreach and engagement with you and things like that. One of the things I do for some of my companies is, rather than have honeybees, I organise bee safaris where we walk around their grounds, or we go off site and we go on a bee walk. And I'll take them on wild bee walks, and I talk to them and engage them about wild pollinators and the importance of wild pollinators and considering wild pollinators. And I go out with a net and some little pots, and we actually catch what these wild bees, and they get to look at them in the hand in a little pot, and then we release them, sort of thing. So it's educating them about wild bees. You can do things like that as well. You don't have to get a hive of honeybees to help bees and to engage your staff. There's lots of other things that you can do.
A very big thank you to Mark for taking the time to share his profound knowledge, and thank you to you, as always, for listening. A big thank you as well to the Patreon subscribers who make it easier each week to pay for the website and the podcast editing, which is done by the long-suffering and good-humoured Pete. This week's shout-out to good people doing good work is to Howe Green Nursery, a family-run trade nursery over in Kent. Simon, Kaz and Simon's parents have run the place for years, and it's a pleasure to have watched the business grow and thrive, and to have seen the arrival of Francesca, who's showing signs of being just as mad about plants as her dad. There's a link to their website in the show notes. Dr. Ian Bedford is next, talking about a bug that is the stuff of kids and dahlia growers' nightmares.
Often found resting during the day in moist locations under rocks, dead plant material, and various nooks and crannies around the garden are the earwigs. These 15mm long shiny brown insects, sporting an impressive pair of pincers on the end of their bodies, are mainly nocturnal scavengers that feed on decaying plant material, carrion, and small insects such as aphids. But unfortunately, they'll also sometimes feed on the petals of certain plants such as dahlia, chrysanthemum, and clematis. Despite having the appearance of an aggressive insect, earwigs are actually quite docile, and primarily use their pincers just for defence. Yet unlike most other non-social insects, earwigs dotingly care for their young, carefully protecting their 40 to 50 eggs throughout the winter, until they hatch into little white nymphs that they then feed and tend to until they're ready to look after themselves. Knowing this, it may seem sad that earwigs are often controlled when they're damaging flowers in the garden, but this doesn't have to involve killing them, since they can easily be trapped alive if need be, by loosely filling a few empty drink bottles with strips of damp paper, then inverting them on bamboo canes amongst the affected plants. The earwigs will then crawl into the bottles when the sun begins to rise, and can be collected and relocated accordingly. In fact, besides being just a sporadic plant pest, earwigs contribute greatly to the composting and recycling processes in our gardens, so could be deemed more beneficial than bad. However, centuries ago, during medieval times, earwigs were often feared by people, as they were wrongly assumed to be spreading diseases and venomous. In addition, the medieval folk believed that whilst they slept, earwigs would crawl into their ears and begin tunnelling inside their heads. And so this is the reason why they were called earwigs, wig being the Old English word for wiggler. And this belief wasn't just here in Britain, since the French named them ear piercers and the Germans earworms. But was there any truth in this myth? Well, nowadays, we all know that earwigs don't actively search out our ears at night, and even if one did accidentally enter an ear, it certainly wouldn't burrow into our head. But many years ago, our medieval ancestors, who may have slept on a bed of straw on the ground, might well have unwittingly provided earwigs with a couple of safe, moist havens to rest within during the day.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.